Good afternoon. My name is Denise Hill and I'm Head of Engagement at Visit Scotland. Along with my colleague Chris Greenwood, I'm delighted that we're going to be meeting with you today on the topic of planning, and in particular the topic of scenario planning as a tool to help businesses to plan their next steps through and out the other side of the challenges presented by the current COVID pandemic. Now, many of you will already be familiar with the VisitScotland.org hub website for industry, where we share a wide range of resources for tourism businesses, and at this time that includes things like data and insights relating to the COVID pandemic, how it's impacting on tourism globally, how it's impacting on our key markets, and at a Scotland level. There are things on there like pre-recorded presentations on topics such as the profile of the first visitors to return, or best practice examples of how businesses are adapting to meet these challenges and opportunities. Now, the scenario planning toolkit, and you see the cover of that here on the slide, the scenario planning toolkit that we'll be discussing today is a further resource that has been posted up there on VisitScotland.org. We published that up there back at the end of last year as a resource to support businesses, and it's available for everyone there to access and make use of. The genesis of this toolkit really came about as a result of discussions with STERG, the Scottish Tourism Emergency Response Group, who were keen to do some work on scenario planning, and they reached out at that time to Chris Greenwood and his team, who conducted a piece of work for the group. And Chris won't mind me saying that the initial version, rightly, was a much higher level academic kind of an exercise, but we very quickly identified that this could be a really useful tool if adapted for businesses for their own personal use. We wanted it to be a real resource for industry, and that could then be published up on VisitScotland.org. As we were developing it and adjusting it for that purpose, trying to make it as useful as possible, we approached some members of industry, some of the sector leads, to try and see if we could get some valuable input from them on just how useful would this be, how fit for their membership, how accessible. And Victoria Brooke, who's with us today from Wild Scotland, was among those who helped us to create this resource. So many thanks to Victoria for that. When we were doing this, we discussed that actually it would be really useful to road test the toolkit, not just put it up on .org and leave it there for businesses to use independently, but to do an exercise of road testing it with a group of businesses from the sector, so that we could see what the reaction would be, what kind of outputs we would get, and just how useful a tool that it was. And Victoria was enormously helpful in pulling together a group of businesses from your sector who were happy to work through the exercise with us. And as a result of that, we've been able to gather a whole host of their thoughts and ideas and feedback, which has fueled today's presentation for you. Now, looking back over the last 10 months, there has been a lot done by Wild Scotland and partners inputting into the work of STERG and into other discussions to represent the needs of the sector, to identify where there's guidance and support needed. Today's presentation is about turning the focus then to the future and planning for the next 3 months, 9 months, 12 months. And we know that planning at a time when we cannot yet be sure of the various scenarios that we will be facing is incredibly difficult, but it's nonetheless critical to emerging through restart in due course and eventually to the recovery of industry. Now, we'll see now that we don't have all of the answers here, but we have worked with a group of your peers to gather, as I say, their ideas on the back of the scenario planning tools. their thoughts and ideas may not map exactly onto your own business and your own experience, but I do hope that what we'll be able to share today will be a really useful starter for 10 for businesses in the sector, considering the scenarios and looking to perhaps start making some use of this toolkit resource. Now, we've allowed some time in this hour for questions and thoughts and comments. At the end of Chris Greenwood's session, which is coming up imminently, but please do use the questions tab, the questions button at the top of the screen if you have any questions that you want to type in as we go along, so that when we get to that point in the proceedings, we'll be able to turn and address the questions that you have typed in there. So please look for that questions button and use that there to type in your contributions or your questions. And now, just before we do hand over then to Chris Greenwood, Visit Scotland's Insights Manager, who's going to share something of the process that we went through, as well as then the outputs that we got from the scenario planning workshop. I'd like just first to hand over to Victoria Brooke from Wild Scotland, who has been, as I say, so helpful in pulling together a group of the peer businesses to work on this exercise. Victoria, would you like to say a few words at this point?
Thank you very much, Denise, and thank you very much, team Visit Scotland. Good afternoon, everybody. I hopefully will know a lot of you in the room today, and a lot of you will be members of Wild Scotland. For those that aren't members of Wild Scotland, we are the national association representing wildlife, adventure and activity tourism in Scotland. And as Denise says, I'm Victoria Brooks and I'm the manager of Wild Scotland. It's really, really good to be here today and to once again have that opportunity to partner with Visit Scotland in making this event happen. The team at Visit Scotland do benefit from incredible expertise and knowledge, and it's a privilege to be able to work with them to ensure that we can offer that incredibly valuable but very specific sector support. And this relates back to the feedback that we gave to Visit Scotland around the scenario planning and how important it is that this kind of support is specific to our sector, and that practical support is so important as well for businesses within the adventure tourism sector. We recognise this is an incredibly difficult time for all of you, and we all know from the announcement yesterday that it is feeling almost impossible to be able to plan ahead in relation to regional differences, physical distancing, group sizes and travel restrictions. You'll all be very desperate to get back up and running again, and I really do feel your frustrations. As Denise has already highlighted this afternoon, it's not this morning, the aim of the session is very much to help you plan for those different scenarios that we might face this year. And I was going to give you just a little bit of background, but Denise has really run through this, but our role in this was pulling together a group of our members, and it was actually about pulling together a really diverse group of members to help Visit Scotland prepare this very specific sector support. And the members that we included included various activity operators, but also marine operators and wildlife watching operators. And the workshop then took place with Visit Scotland with Wild Scotland's support. The discussions I found incredibly interesting, and what it did actually highlight is the really unique set of challenges that we face as a sector that are actually quite different from other sectors within tourism. The discussion was very valuable, and it did include various topics, from what the opportunities are ahead to what are our biggest threats and what is our sector really good at. And there is so much that we're good at, and there is so much opportunity ahead, and we must never forget that. There really is so much opportunity ahead. It was a really interesting session, and it was led by Chris and Denise, and we had Patrick and Rona working away behind the scenes, analysing everything that was said. So I hope that what we learned in that session, along with Chris's valuable insights, will really help towards your planning for the challenges that we are likely to face over the coming months. And I'm really, really looking forward to hearing now from Chris and what the team in Visit Scotland have come up with. And thank you very much, Visit Scotland, for giving Wild Scotland this opportunity. And I would like to hand back now to Chris from Visit Scotland. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Victoria. Firstly, my name is Chris Greenwood. I'm one of the insight managers here at Visit Scotland. I was involved with the scenarios, as Denise mentioned, back when we were producing them for STERG. STERG, the Scottish Tourism Emergency Response Group, is a cooperative, if you want, of public sector bodies, including Visit Scotland, enterprise agencies, COSLA, the Scottish Government, and the Scottish Tourism Alliance is the industry representative. And they're the interface between understanding what the tourism industry's needs and requirements are at this very challenging time, and feeding those through to the Scottish Government, and subsequently delivering the policy and kind of actions that come back from government. And an example of that, of course, is the grant funding that has been available across multiple sectors that we've seen in the media, and that you'll have heard through various kind of industry organisations, Wild Scotland being one. So the scenarios that we produced were in response of being able to kind of stress test the recovery strategy that STERG had developed, and they wanted to make sure that, dependent on what unforeseen circumstances may appear down the road, the strategy would be able to respond accordingly. Now, that said, we are in a situation where our traditional measures of tourism performance, volume and value that we would get from things like the International Passenger Survey, which is produced by the Office of National Statistics, and the domestic tourism monitors and things like that. These haven't been running over the course of the pandemic for reasons that range from they were face-to-face interviews, and they took place in places like airports, and obviously the sensitivities of asking consumers if they've been traveling at a time where during a lockdown, obviously nobody has been traveling. So, you know, we don't have that baseline of information of who's traveling and when. So we've had to go to alternative sources of data collection for interpretation. Amongst these are the scenario planning, which we'll come on to in a second, but we also have on VisitScotland.org a range of resources that may be valuable to you, and I would really recommend you going on to the VisitScotland.org website and the COVID support pages, where you'll be able to find things like domestic and now international consumer sentiment surveys. So this is a survey that shows the attitude of the consumer towards travel, what their intentions are, and certainly when we ran the domestic consumer sentiment survey over the course of summer and autumn last year, we found that you know, Scotland in particular, and in particular rural Scotland, certainly indexed very high in the minds of the domestic consumer as somewhere where they wanted to spend their leisure time when they were able to travel. And we believe that the indicators that we're getting now and the surveys we're conducting are indicating that that will be a similar case, that Scotland, and in particular rural Scotland, will be particularly popular with the travelling public, and there's definitely pent-up demand there. So, you know, there is potential once we know the roadmap that we're going to be taking to allow people to travel. That said, what we did was we conducted a scenario planning exercise, and for those of you who may not be familiar, scenario planning is a process where you identify for the system or the business, so in our case tourism and adventure tourism, what are the factors that are of greatest influence at this particular point in time, and our scenarios are really looking at the period of the current uncertainty that we're in, taking us through to really when we have a sustained recovery within the tourism sector. So we're predicting that the scenarios are valid up until the end of 2021, when we hope, as we move into 2022 and onwards, that the pandemic will have been abated and we'll be able to live and operate much more normally than we have before. I'm not saying that we're not going to still experience issues over maybe localized lockdowns or things like that, but certainly we will live in a more sort of controlled environment. Obviously, if the situation changes, I think many people would have hoped that we might have been at that situation of being able to live with coronavirus within society at this particular stage. But obviously we've entered into a second kind of wave and subsequent lockdown that we still see that the scenarios will be valid up until that point. So if it takes us beyond 2022, which we hope obviously that's not the case, that the scenarios will still be valid up until we move on to the next level of strategy, which will be the sustained recovery of tourism. So, excuse me, scenarios. What they are is a series of stories, possible futures, kind of snapshots, if you want, of how things might develop dependent on the variables that you're looking at. What they're not is a prediction of the future, that unless your objective is to reach a specific objective, the idea isn't to sort of see one scenario and then work towards that. The idea is that within your organization, you will have a business plan, a strategy, and an objective that you want to achieve. Now, you can determine what that objective would be, but then what you do is you take your strategy to achieve that objective and test it against each of the scenarios. And in our particular case, we have 5 of them. And you have to sort of ask yourself, is my strategy fit for purpose should this particular scenario begin to develop? Now, if it does begin, you then have to sort of say, well, are there aspects of my strategy that I need to change, or do I need to possibly reconsider what my objective is in this particular situation? And therefore, at the end of the day, you'll have that level of agility and kind of flexibility to be able to face the future. Now, that's not to say that it isn't challenging at the moment, but we hope that the scenarios that we've developed cover a range of situations, some that we've already experienced, but certainly ones that you might want to consider and be able to stress test your planning and strategy. So when we did the workshops, we concentrated on 2 scenarios, and this was partly because we wanted to maximize the amount of time that we had for the workshops, but also we felt the 2 scenarios that we chose represented what we're experiencing right now, but also what we expect the recovery to be in. And what's interesting is that this presentation is the first one that's taken place since the announcement yesterday from the First Minister about what the potential roadmap out of recovery is. So all the work that we did beforehand was before we knew roughly when we possibly might be moving back to a tier system, and when non-essential retail might be opening, and of course when there's the possibility of the reopening of tourism, which I know hasn't been clarified right now, but certainly now that we've got the kind of outline of the roadmap from the Scottish Government, it would certainly help many people in their planning and strategy. So anyway, the 2 scenarios that we looked at was, the first one was called our baseline scenario. And this was essentially what tourism looked like when it restarted in July of 2020. And this, if you think, was a staggered reopening of businesses. but businesses that had to operate within restrictions of maybe limited capacity, physical distancing, hygiene, demonstrating hygiene and cleanliness. And there could also be sort of concerns amongst the consumer about their confidence in being able to travel. The other scenario that we looked at was one called 5 Winters, and this was really our worst case scenario. And as Victoria mentioned, it's unfortunate that we called it 5 Winters because, as we've seen in Cairngorms, they're having some of the best snow for skiing that they've seen for a number of years. But what it represented was 3 to 5 consecutive quarters of low season performance. And if you think we probably had one in Q4 of last year, certainly Q1 of this year could be described as low season performance. What if you had another 2 or 3 low season performance, either through continued lockdown or just like very minimal sort of travel? What are you going to do as a business to respond to that? And you know, the preparation and things that you'd be required to do that. So those are the 2 scenarios. We can see on the diagram the variables that we used to determine the scenarios. And these were based on 2 very fundamental kind of conditions that during the pandemic, the consumer environment was either confident or they could travel, or they were insecure and couldn't travel. So either people were, you know, wanting to go out and be there, but some people could be shielding. The other way of looking at it is during a lockdown, either people would want to travel but can't, or you know they're free to travel and they will do. The other variable was the industry environment, the operating environment, and it could either be very restrictive or very open. And again, in a lockdown when businesses have to close, that is a very restrictive environment. And remember, we had localized lockdowns as well. Or it could be a very open environment. So, you know, there are no restrictions. It's very much how it used to be. So the other scenarios that we looked at that were in the toolkit, but we didn't use these within the workshops, were one called the old normal. This is one that could be pretty much considered the pre-pandemic level of tourism. So think of tourism pre-2020, and the question that we need to ask is, in terms of your strategy, were there aspects about the old normal that maybe you want to change? So if you remember, there were concerns about over tourism, you know, pressure on, you know, particularly areas, so, you know, from Edinburgh to the ferry pools at Skye, that we're seeing maybe too many tourists. Concerns over the environment, sustainability, could be other areas that maybe you want to consider within your strategy to respond to that particular scenario. The other one, scenario 3, was one called doors open. This was one that could be considered if you're maybe like a Highland business or maybe a business in the borders, when the central belt was locked down towards kind of late autumn, it cut off some of the key markets. We weren't able to receive visitors from the rest of the UK, and certainly not internationally. But when the central belts, you know, Edinburgh, Glasgow, people weren't allowed to travel outside of those areas. You have businesses up in the Highlands, for example, that were still able to operate because their tier level allowed them to, but they might not be eligible for support that may have been available because they were able to trade, but there was no you know, customers that could be drawn on to do that. So in those situations, how do you maybe engage with the local business, local consumers, and how do you amend your product accordingly? The final scenario was one called the long chill, and this assumes one where it's a case that businesses are very restricted in their operating, but there's pent-up demand amongst the consumer. And if you think about maybe the Scottish cities that throughout this have seen a very different kind of performance profile to that of rural areas, in that perhaps consumers were more apprehensive about going to cities. Maybe if we look at the visitor attraction sector, wanting to go to indoor attractions. So you've got this situation where you've got this kind of very restrictive operating environment, and one that consumers find it very difficult to engage with. So those are the three other scenarios that we also looked at. Anyway, as part of the workshop, what we did was we started off by doing a SWOT analysis, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities and threats, that related to the adventure tourism sector. From that, we looked at the implications of the outputs of that SWOT exercise on the sector, on individual businesses, and we looked at the implications on the customers, the product, staff, and suppliers as well. And from that, we then determined a list of kind of actions that involved things like what needs to continue to be done, what needs to be ramped up, and also some big ideas, some big game changers that are going to take place that could really make a difference. And we applied those to the two scenarios, our baseline scenario and the 5 winter scenario. So there was a big long list of strengths, weaknesses, opportunities and threats. But what I've done is I've kind of summarized these into these bullet points, really just to kind of summarize everything. So looking at the adventure tourism sector, the strengths that were identified within the workshop are, like you're working with Scotland's natural assets, and not only are many of you utilising rural locations, and of course being based within sort of like open air, rural, and bear in mind there are many rural areas close to urban centres as well, and green spaces. There was a consumer perspective of safety. Consumers repeatedly said in the consumer sentiment work that they wanted to go to open spaces, they wanted the fresh air, they wanted to feel as though they're amongst nature, especially those that had been maybe locked down within cities, and kind of really yearn for those open spaces and being able to control their environment as well. But you also have to remember that many people are inspired by the Scottish landscape, and certainly it's one of the three kind of areas that repeatedly come out of visitor surveys, that the Scottish landscape, heritage and culture and warmth, welcome are the three areas that people think of when they think of Scotland. So, being a sector that utilises the natural assets, you can play on those two areas. You have a diverse product range, and we saw that it covers everything. From sort of guided tours to marine and coastal, to high adrenaline, to slow tourism. There is a fantastic range, and also a massive geographical spread, from urban through to rural and islands. So that is seen as a key strength. But you also have a reputation of sort of being seen as healthy, outdoor, friendly, engaging. You've got characters that work within your organisations that really chime with the consumer as well, and that's something that certainly can work through in marketing. And then finally, you've got your innate risk assessment culture, and that really sort of reflects the fact that you care about your consumer, obviously, and you demonstrate the safety that you're going to project onto them, so that when they undertake the activities, they know that they're safe. But that goes through in the belief in the consumer, in your ability to undertake cleansing regimes. They know that they're safe being with you during a pandemic as well. Looking at weaknesses, it was identified that because we believe that there's going to be a kind of phased reopening, it could be a very hyper-local market that is available first. Certainly it could be within your own local authority area, then moving to Scottish domestic market, rest of UK and international. So there is a challenge to kind of generate local demand. You know, how do you engage with local consumers that maybe don't think that you know, those activities are something they can do on their doorstep, that, you know, that's something that you have to travel, you know, as part of a bigger holiday to do. So that was seen as a challenge. On the other part of that was there were concerns for communities and sensitive areas. Firstly, there is the kind of innate concern about communities, about maybe strangers coming in, and that was the case in the summer last year, and you know, the potential that, particularly within rural areas, that you know, the virus could be brought in with people, and therefore, you know, what role do tourism businesses have as being, firstly, part of the community, but also protecting that community because of the industry that they're involved in. There was also some interesting conversations around managing customer expectations, and that was the one that kind of comes through on the quote of, you know, well, dolphins don't appear on demand. So, you know, how do you manage people's expectations that they will be able to see and do all the things? And this led to quite an interesting conversation around things like sort of social media and selfie culture, and you know, the role that the adventure tourism sector has in maybe educating, but also sort of providing a certain reality as to, you know, what is available to do within the sector. You know, as I said, if people are expecting to see, you know, aurora, or they're expecting to see dolphins and it doesn't happen, what is the implication of that at the beginning and the end of that person's experience? And then the other one is, whilst we've talked about the risk assessment culture being a strength, many of the activities require close proximity, and therefore there were issues around possible capacity. So if you are running a boat, for example, you might not be able to take on the same number of people that you would normally do to ensure that there is sufficient physical distancing, and therefore what is the implication of sort of income that has. In terms of opportunities and threats, well, there was sort of product diversification, and this again went back to possibly creating maybe short-term product lines that would meet maybe local demand, and then changing those as new markets become available, and creating that reason for a visit. Technology adoption is one that's been consistent across all the workshops that we've done, certainly about online booking and digital content, and just making sure that people are embracing those areas. But also the role that outdoor activity has on mental health, and certainly wellness was a constant theme through all the discussions we had. And again, there's the fact that as a tourism provider and an adventure tourism provider, your presence as within the local community kind of can be a source of pride, because you can send out those messages that maybe will offset some of the negative activity that occurred last year. So, you know, your role in sort of like providing education to the wider sort of populace, if you want, might have an action in reducing things like dirty camping and things like that. Finally, the threats. Of course, there was the dependency on other sectors opening. You know, will you be able to operate if there is no hospitality businesses and no accommodation providers? So there was that. There was a lot of talk around about staff retention, and the fact that some staff that were seasonal may have taken on other jobs, and therefore will these kind of experienced, skilled individuals want to come back into the sector to be able to provide the services that you want. And then finally, there was about reputation management, and there was kind of discussion around the role of influencers and their kind of impact on and demands as well on the sector. And as I said, that right to the selfie and you know, setting those levels of expectation. So once we did the SWOT exercise, we then wanted to sort of try and interpret all this information and the implications and the actions. So we created a matrix where we sort of took the strengths and weaknesses, opportunities and threats, which could be considered an internal and external factors and forces, and sort of tried to come up with a list of meaningful kind of outputs that can be used within the scenario toolkit. So the matrix kind of said, okay, well, if we take the strengths and opportunities, how do you maximize opportunities from the strengths, but at the same time minimize the weaknesses to diminish threats by looking at the exercise that we did. So from that, we developed the following. So capitalizing on the strengths. Mentioned before, the role of technology and the use of social media for communicating. Certainly, many of you have got some very rich content and there's some very inspirational imagery that's coming through. Many people now, consumers, are seeing the planning process of planning a holiday and kind of curating their bucket list, if you want, of what they're going to do when they can finally travel. And this is becoming a much more prevalent exercise, certainly in terms of mindfulness and kind of mental health, but also as a way of passing the time. So, you know, the social media content is a key channel in being able to feed in to that kind of armchair travel that's taking at the moment, but which will certainly spill over into actual purchasing and behaviour. We've got the local suppliers, and I know that many of you do use local suppliers, but it certainly adds to the role that of collaboration, of being able to get visitors to tie into to local suppliers and spread the tourism spend that's coming to you more broadly within the community, which obviously then adds to the overall experience the visitor has. We know that people want to give back at the moment, and therefore being able to promote volunteering options, and this isn't necessarily volunteering that you have to organise, but being aware of maybe things that you can refer people to that will be another draw to maybe keep them in, stay longer and undertake more activities. And of course, rewilding is a great example of that. Personalisation and premiumisation is something that we've kind of mentioned previously, but certainly at the moment people want to feel as though they're getting a personalised product, and you know, it's getting that balance of kind of the more kind of mass tourism product against something that is more individualistic, and certainly being able to tailor products which, you know, can be provide a greater cost, and certainly within the luxury market, being able to get that level of exclusivity from a safe, you know, like a perceived safety perspective is one that would be there. In terms of innovation, I think many people over recent time have taken up activities such as wild swimming, paddle boarding, mountain biking, running, things like that. So there's fantastic opportunities for running skills building courses, you know, to maybe teach people how to do navigation, maybe survival skills, you know, things like that are tying into the activities that they're or, you know, have been taking up over the period of the last 12 months. But there's also opportunities for kind of what we refer to as family bonding. So, you know, in outdoor spaces, you know, families being able to come together again after possibly being locked up or maybe being separated, being able to come together and rebond over an activity, you know, when it's allowed, would be an interesting and attractive offering for many. But the key one was this creation of local friendly packages, you know, maybe things that are shorter duration and more competitive price points. But the idea is to kind of create ambassadors that would then be able to act as a link between the community at large, but also to draw more people into your business as well, and also create those referrals that are so valuable in terms of being able to create word of mouth. But on that side, being online bookable, which I know many of you are, is seen as a key area. Many people want to engage directly with the provider rather than going through intermediaries. But also there's, collaborating and cross-selling. As we said, just informing people that, other tourism providers that you're open and operating, and that will allow them to be able to bring in might make them consider about reopening as well. So you get your accommodation and your visitor attractions and all the other things that makes the overall destination attractive to be able to go to. There was the talk about, sort of capitalizing on your family-friendly reputation, sort of safe, outdoor, able to allow people to interact. Those were seen as the key strengths. Looking at some of the weaknesses, just being able to maintain good communication with customers, but also communicating with your staff as well. Many of them may have issues over homeschooling, they may have dependents, they may have underlying health conditions that prevent them. So just being able to communicate both with customers so that they know all the information they need to prepare to purchase your product, but on the other hand, making sure that you're communicating with staff to understand the issues. Similar thing goes through to talking about suppliers as well. There was talk about sort of shortages of certain key items of equipment due to supplies that maybe come through from Europe, which are causing shortages. What about local suppliers who maybe have furloughed staff and therefore wouldn't be able to ramp up in maybe food offerings or things like that? Also, if there is a disruption, what are your alternatives to be able to continue to be able to trade? In terms of making sure that health and safety is front of mind, thinking about safety regimes, certifications. Certainly the Good to Go scheme is an excellent stamp to have on your website, and one that the consumer can identify with and recognize. But also, making sure that on the other side, you're sensitive to kind of the community on reopening, and making sure that, maybe you're engaging with your local DMO and other sort of broader businesses to make sure that, you're doing everything you can to minimize the risks that are coming through. And also that there's going to be a control in the number of visitors that are coming through, and that destinations aren't going to be maybe swamped with loads of people. But it ultimately comes down with having a strategy that allows you to have a template for reopening, so that you're aware of all the aspects that you need to put in place. All that said, there were some excellent kind of case studies that I came across, and three that really came to mind was Wild Tree Adventures and the lines that they were putting in on safety commitment. And in the text itself, it refers to all the work that's being done to follow government guidelines on COVID-19 prevention. But it was the line that came out that says that our training and expertise to operate is one that shows our capabilities as individuals and a community. And I think that really kind of reflected what we were saying about people believe that the adventure tourism sector is certainly one that is focused on safety, and therefore is one that will be able to interpret what needs to be done to prevent the spread of COVID-19. Primal bushcraft, this was another one that was really pushing the whole kind of wellness and mental health, and certainly again engaging content that was pushing around that was linking that recognition of what we're going through at the moment to the product that they were producing, and certainly that was a consistent theme that was coming through in some of their channels. And then finally, Red Moon Cruises. And they have this kind of series of big Scottish, escapes And some of the images that were coming through there, which were consistent, regular, certainly were inspiring for me, and ones that you know, sort of I was drawn into, sort of like see the entire kind of theme of all of the pictures that they'd posted. So there are just kind of 3 case studies. Just to sort of finish off this section before we're going on to the Q&A. As I said at the beginning, our expectation is that the reopening of tourism will see the hyper-local. So this will probably be, people will be able to travel, you know, like the stay-at-home restriction will be lifted, but you'll have to stay within your own local authority area. So the initial market is going to be the local market, followed by Scottish domestic, rest of UK, and international. Obviously, some of these may overlap at particular stages, and we may find that some non-flying, you know, sort of touring European markets might be coming ahead of other international markets, but certainly the timescales on those will be much further down the line. So, you know, how are you going to respond in the initial period to a hyper-local market and a Scottish domestic market? We see the strengths and opportunities around the sector are certainly based around agility, adaptability, familiarity, and quality. And those are things that really are seen as core to the adventure tourism sector. And the weaknesses and threats can be minimized through your own confidence, innovation, and flexibility, which is the whole point of having these scenarios, to be able to test your strategy against these multiple different possibilities that develop. We know that the sector is stronger in collaboration, and you need the accommodation sector and hospitality sector to be there, but also the visitor attraction sector, which adds to the overall kind of attractiveness of a destination for somebody to commit to travel, to stay and engage with your product along with many others as part of a longer stay. And obviously, if we encourage people to stay longer and spend more, that's got to be better for the wider community. But you know, there was also communication with customers, suppliers, staff, and colleagues is so important for the reasons I said, that staff may have specific needs and they maybe want some reassurance, but also customers, they want information to know what there is to do and how they can actually do it within the restrictions that may be available in a particular area. But as many of you know, Wild Scotland is a fantastic industry organisation, and along with the destination groups that we have, these are the ones where you'll be able to kind of share information and experience and be able to sort of like navigate through all of these. So we know that the adventure tourism sector will have a positive place, certainly because of the demands of consumers in what they want to do in 2021. So, you know, how will you plan, prepare, and position to respond to the future? Thank you very much. I'm going to hand back to Denise now, and I think we've got some time for questions and comments.
Thank you, Chris. I think we've certainly got some questions here, which is grand. One of them for you, Chris, is around population shift, and whether Chris thinks, what kind of impact Chris thinks that population shift may have on the hospitality industry in Scotland. And while you think about that one, Chris, there is another question in here about the recommendations we've made here on collaboration, and in particular collaboration with accommodation providers. What advice do we have on that? I think 2 or 3 things spring to mind immediately with regard to the accommodation piece. In the same way that Wild Scotland, for instance, in the last 10 months has even further strengthened its role as a sector group in Scotland. I think we're starting to see the same thing happening with some of the accommodation sectors as well. So engaging and trying to engage via those sector groups, whether that's the Association of Self-Caterers or the BHNHPA for camping and caravanning, for instance, that might be one route to do that. Another route, however, is through the DMOs, the Destination Management Organisations. Again, these are our organisations that we've been working to try and strengthen through this. So if your requirement is to engage with accommodation in particular locations, getting closer to the DMO in those areas might help. And a final thought just from me on that one is also about using platforms like, normally in a normal year, we would have been planning for our Visit Scotland Expo event, that is our big travel trade event. This year, we won't be doing that. We'll be having a purely virtual event. We'll be having our second of the Scotland Reconnect events, which is free of charge. And one of the things that we are building into that is a day prior to the workshops proper, where Scottish businesses can engage with one another. So that's another platform where a Scottish activity operator could get together with some of the accommodation, some of the most engaged accommodation providers in Scotland there, perhaps, to have that conversation. But we'd be happy, our own team would be happy to take any particular questions on that if the writer of this question wants to reach out to us, and we'll see how we can perhaps help with that. Chris, has that given you time to think about population shift and the hospitality?
Yep.
Any thoughts on that one?
So yeah, we obviously recognise that sort of depopulation, particularly in rural areas, is an issue that needs to be addressed. And I think that there are initiatives that are taking place, certainly within enterprise agencies and local authorities to address that. I think more fundamentally to do with hospitality is the fact that there is currently a shortage of trains, waiting staff, kitchen staff, those areas, and this is being exacerbated through Brexit as well. I know that the various hospitality kind of organisations, I think it's HIT Scotland, and also Skills Development Scotland, have developed a number of strategies to try and address this. I think it's the fundamental issue of just being able to try and provide the opportunities for people to see employment in these sectors as attractive, and that requires things like consideration around more shall we say, what's the word? Sort of family-friendly policies around kind of shift patterns and obviously improvements in pay. I don't have an answer to the repopulation of rural areas, I'm afraid, but certainly I think sort of improvements in sort of digital networks are meaning that we can work anywhere nowadays. So certainly one of the things that's come out of the last 12 months is home working can take place, in the central belt, in the Highlands, and if so desired, Barbados on a 12-month work visa. So there are opportunities to address this, but I think there are still some structural problems that need to be addressed.
Thanks, Chris.
I hope that answers the question.
There's another question that I'm going to pose to you, Chris, while I answer a different one. The question is, what do the panel believe is reasonable to consider as local within the concept of local market at the present time, especially if you're a business focused up in the Highland region? Meantime, I'll answer the question. Somebody's keen to hear more on social media and keen to see organisations like our own sharing some of the posts that they're putting out there. I'm going to flag up a slide that's coming up just at the very end of our presentation, just in minutes time, where we've listed out a whole lot of email addresses there that you can reach out to at Visit Scotland for all sorts of purposes. One of those in particular is to share your social media. There we go, up it goes. Any content ideas, social media ideas that you have, so that you can share that with our dedicated team here at Visit Scotland. Chris, on the concept of local market.
So yeah, we said in the presentation our expectation of sort of tourism, and bear in mind that when we were doing the workshops, we didn't have the knowledge of yesterday's announcement of kind of roadmaps that were taking place in England and Scotland. But we see the local market initially being those within your own local authority area. Now, you know, the tier 3 category meant that you were able to you know, leave home, your home to do various activities other than just exercise and, you know, essential retail. So you know, for some people, the Highlands is obviously a major sort of geographic area. For the people of Clackmannanshire, you know, not so large a geographical area, but we see local as being that. The next stage would be an expectation that it would be the Scottish domestic market. So there may be restrictions on cross-border traffic with the rest of the UK. That was something we experienced last year, more so with localized lockdowns in England preventing people from traveling. So, you know, we also see local being the Scottish domestic market as well. And then when the rest of the UK comes in, that's what we generally see as our full domestic market. Denise, I don't know if you've got any thoughts on kind of the international markets, and you know, I think there's many people that are talking about, you know, sort of maybe this year, maybe next year, maybe 2023. Airlines are looking at 2024 before going back to normal and things like that.
Yeah, I think what we'll have to do, because we've got 2 minutes, and using this system, it will close down on us when we come to the deadline. So I think what we'll do is, if any questions haven't been answered here, we will answer them subsequently. So watch out, we will come back to you. I think we've already had a bit of a summing up from Chris today, this afternoon, on the strengths and the challenges for the adventure and activity and wildlife sector. And he said there, I think what we need to remember as we come out of today's session is scenario planning does not predict anything for us, but it certainly does help us to decide what it is that we need to do now in order to try and shape the future for ourselves. I hope you're feeling inspired to try and download the Planning Toolkit now from VisitScotland.org. Have a go, either on your own or with some of your team, perhaps, and see if you can work through your own response to the scenarios in there. Next steps for us will be to publish this presentation. It will go up, so somebody had asked that question, it will go up on VisitScotland.org, together with some, what I'm calling companion materials, so the SWOT analysis and some of the other materials that came out of the workshop will go up there. So when you go in to try and use the generic toolkit, you will be able to use alongside that some sector-specific resources there as well. Keep watching.org for other things that are coming up. You will find information on there on how to amplify social media, your own social media posts. You'll also find information on things like our digital boost seminars, one of which is coming up tomorrow. So digital fundamentals for the tourism industry, that's happening tomorrow. So have a look on VisitScotland.org and see if that might be something for you too. And finally today, I'd just like to thank everybody for giving of their time to listen today, and I'd just like to give Victoria the last word, if there's anything you would like to quickly share, Victoria.
Thank you very much, Denise, and thank you very much, Chris, as always. That was great, and I found it actually very, very inspirational, and particularly like the toes, turning the SWOT around and capitalising on the strengths. So, but really, really great. Thank you very much. I just wanted to highlight a couple of sector-specific events before time runs out. Many of you here will know of the WISE scheme. It's about wildlife watching, marine wildlife watching safely, ensuring that minimum disturbance to wildlife. And it's a national standard accreditation with a very clear code of conduct. It is focused on the boat sector, but there is a very exciting new course that's about to come out, which is for adventure operators, particularly around coastal adventures. The course will be running Monday the 22nd to Thursday the 25th of March, and it's planned to cost about £50 per head. There will be more information next week on the WISE website. We will share, Visit Scotland team will share that with you all later on today or tomorrow, but just really wanted to highlight that because it's a great opportunity. The other one is the virtual Arta Adventure Elevate Europe conference, which takes place on the 24th and 25th of March as well, similar dates. A great opportunity for adventure businesses to be able to network, share and grow knowledge, but on a global scale, which is really important. So it will be that opportunity to get together with industry professionals directly working in adventure tourism. There'll be a real mix of practical and interactive sessions with virtual adventures and keynotes, all with sustainability at the core, aiming to inspire the entire travel community from small business owners to guides, industry partners and destination representatives. So a really, really great opportunity. So if you have the time, Visit Scotland have been able to negotiate a reduced rate of $69 to join this 2-day event. So again, the link will be sent to you. It's on visitscotland.org, but a really good opportunity to join in with this event. Thank you again to the team today. Specific support like this is incredibly valuable to our sector, and I hope that we can do more and more that in relation to our sector. And just to finish off, collaboration amongst businesses is so valuable. We can learn so much from each other, and this really does come across in the work that we are doing at the moment with our members, from our member clinics to sessions just like this. So just a plea to you all to keep talking and keep connecting with Wild Scotland, and thank you very much.